Now, you may have heard about this little game that was announced at PDXCon 2021. Yes, it is in fact Victoria 3, and today we're going to be talking about some of the systems behind this game, specifically the economy. Unlike some of the other PDS titles, this is not, like EU4, a map painter. This is not like Crusader Kings 2 or 3, a dynasty simulator. It is not like Stellaris, where the focus is more about discovery and a little bit of economy building, or Hearts of Iron, where the world is at war and you should man the guns. No, Victoria 3 is all about tending the garden that is your nation. Now, obviously, the Renaissance has passed. The Age of Sail is still here, but it is 1836, the start date of this game. And why specifically 1836? Well, it is the year that Victoria, the Queen of England, the Empress of India, the Raj, maybe we could call it, gets onto the throne, and henceforth, which is where the name comes from. But it's important to know that the world of 1836 is very, very different, but also kind of similar to ours today. Sure, it is nearly 200 years ago, and there's only 1 billion people in the world, and 800 million of those do not live in cities. They live on subsystems. They are agricultural people, whether or not they live somewhere in East Asia or in Europe, some of the highest density population centers in the world at that time. And the total GDP at the time was maybe 500 million pounds. Yes, globally. And that right there makes the world very interesting, because you go from 1836 to 1936, and that is a massive change, because you go from this society that starts off in what we would refer to these days as a relative squalor into an industrialized environment. Now, of course, that changes from nation to nation. However, how do you get to this point? How do you get from farmers to building the Great Eastern to sending hundreds of thousands to the sum? Now, this is a scenario that you will have to take part in Victoria 3. These are the things that you'll have to deal with. Now, for those of you who have played Victoria 2, or some of the more analogous games, such as, say, Anno 1800, or even Factorio and the like, you will know how the resource trees work. You take a material, you put that material into a factory, and the factory spits out another resource, and so on. Victoria 3 has a very similar approach as such. You will have 50 types of buildings and 50 types of goods that will slowly unlock over time. In 1836, you're not going to have cars, because, let's be honest here, in 1836, the train had only existed for, say, 10 years. But yeah, this is all about production and consumption. You've got your textile mills, you got your wheat farms at the start of your game. You get into the end of the Industrial Revolution at that point, and you need to have the resources in order to get by and advance your population and make sure that your people are happy, so they don't rise up and try to overthrow your government. And this kind of reflects into the game. Some of the more difficult empires to play at the start of the game will most likely be those who do not have a large colonial empire or vast swaths of lands. Therefore, nations like the United States of America, which at the time were very, very different from today, will have an easier time to develop themselves due to their massive amounts of resources than, say, Belgium. Yes, that weird growth coming out of the bottom of the Netherlands. Of course, the strongest nation at the start of the game will be the United Kingdom. And that right there kind of illustrates how powerful some of these nations can get. The larger of an economy you start out with, the more resources you have access to, the better you will perform. Now, you've also got things like governmental buildings, and they consume ammunition, which you will need to generate yourself. But how do you get to a point where you can develop yourself into an empire that can really put themselves on the map from an industrial point of view? Well, we get to infrastructures. You can build ports, you can build railways, and that all builds up slowly over time, and that will be reflected on the world map. And of course, you will need to connect markets and cities in order to get resources moving from A to B. If your population centers are somewhere in the center of the country, but all of your primary resources such as your food, etc., are generated somewhere else, you're still going to need to ship them into your main cities. One of the big things in the era was the whole thing about urbanization, where the people from the agricultural eras, as they industrialized slowly but steadily, were no longer needed and were moved to the cities and the factories. That's one of the defining aspects of the Industrial Revolution.
Infrastructure helps connect the production and consumption throughout your national market.
Yep. So yeah, obviously, very, very important part of the era is connecting the world closer together.
Now, this of course also turns into pricing, because let's say that you have a certain good that nobody else has. You can put it on the market and export it for a third party, and pricing will be different from a market to market because everybody has access to certain markets even. They only need to export items or import items. And this is really problematic for some nations because they are really small. They don't have the internal resources to do the things they need. So they're going to need to go out onto the warpath, potentially, or gunboat diplomacy in order to get the resources that they need, or maybe annex an area where they can get the resources that they need and then import those into their industrial estate and can do what they need to do.
In Victoria 3, we permit for both import and export, and this is market to market, right? So
yes, it has the potential to be beneficial, or it can be another tool of diplomacy, a weapon of war by another means. You can trade with allies, gain the resources as you're not able to have. If you don't have a domestic source of iron, you can trade with a partner and gain that.
Yeah, that's kind of a very basic, I need this thing, import it.
Yes, that's one of the easiest ways to gain it, and then, of course, you'd be reliant upon them to sustain that part of the trade.
Yeah.
But you can also use it in a sort of dastardly way, as if you are noticing that the AI or even another player is doing a very singular focused economy, that they're doing a single resource that is the bedrock of theirs, you can undercut them.
Now, we already touched a little bit on the idea that there is population in the game. Now, the game itself will start off with 1 billion pops at the start in 1836. And all of these pops are modeled to a certain degree. Now, all of these pops obviously will have their own needs. Yeah, they have their needs. They can have their foods, their fish, their meats, their fruits, etc. And they'll need to come from somewhere. And then of course, the more resources they have available, or the more stuff they have in order to fulfill their needs, the higher their standard of living. And if a population has a high standard of living, then they will become loyalistic to the state, and they'll be less inclined to revolt. And that does, of course, have knock-on effects as well, because happy workers work harder, at least to a certain degree, because communism will sooner or later rear its head and try to take your capitalist society and uproot everything, which is, of course, totally possible. And of course, this also translates to things like wages. So you have buildings that can have their own wages, and they will try to maximize their own profit. Now, as a country, you can, of course, say, hey, this is the amount of wage that you can have. If you've got engineers or laborers or capitalists, they will make a wage, which then they can spend onto those basic materials that we talked about earlier on. And of course, there are such things as government subsidies to make sure that wages are nice and high so that everybody's happy. Because if the wages are low, then once again, we may have the standards of living dropping because nobody can afford basic food, and the hyperinflation starts to kick in, and all of a sudden your economy will go bankrupt. And this, of course, also translates into things like taxes, where if you've got income taxes or poll taxes, where you have a per head tax, which is, I believe, highly illegal in most countries. Consumption taxes, so VAT basically is what you're looking at here, or dividends. So, for instance, if your private industries in your country have profits, then you can put taxes on that. So yeah, this is all based around the laws of the land as well, and that is all part of the economy there. Now, on top of that, you've got your trading fleets to import and export goods from wherever, really. You will need to have a large fleet. I think a good example is the merchant fleet of the British Empire during the 1800s, which was absolutely massive. I believe the Dutch were in a very similar boat at the time. And having a strong trade fleet and potentially also a military fleet to support that is going to be important. But if you do not trade the goods that you need, then the living standards are going to go down and you're going to be running into a lot of problems. Therefore, importing goods is going to be really, really important. And this also could translate into whatever economic system you're running. So, for instance, you could go with isolationism or mercantilism or free trade or a at-command economy. This is all tying into the main game, of course. And there's a lot of stuff going on within the generalized economy of Victoria 3. But yeah, in the end, what it all boils down to is that this is very much a advanced economy simulator where you will need to generate the resources for potentially billions, especially if you are the British Empire and you already have one of the largest standing empires in known history, or if you're playing as a smaller nation, once again, let's say Belgium, for example. You don't need to have that many people, but you won't have the ability to go anywhere in particular, and you're going to need to rely on the markets and maybe specialize into a couple of things. These are all part of the Victoria 3 economic system that exists in the background, and if this is something that you want to try, you could go ahead and download Victoria 2. It is currently still available. I tried to run it on my machine, didn't do all too well. So if you want to have a nice taste of some of the basic resource mechanics here that don't necessarily involve pops, etc., you can go ahead and play something like Anno 1800, and if you want to play something with pops, pick up Stellaris. If you're on this channel, you'll most likely already have it, and take that game for a ride, and you will get a good idea of what the economic system will feel like. Now, I want to go and wrap up this video here. If you thought this was interesting, you want to see more in the future, make sure to make yourself known in the comments. Just put a comment down below saying, I want to see more of Victoria 3 in the future, and I will heed your call. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for my patrons for making this video possible, and until next time, take good care of yourselves and, as always, each other.